we are in today to the wonderful, the different, some might even say mysterious book, Letter to the Hebrews.
Indeed, yes. It's always one of those ones, I think, for the first few chapters, why am I reading this? And then the last few chapters, I think, that's my favourite book!
It's a bit different, isn't it? We don't know who wrote it, for sure.
Yeah, correct.
Have you got any theories?
Well, I would, if I had to, I'd go for Apollos.
Okay.
But I quite enjoy the fact that the Bible doesn't care. Everyone was like, we really want to know who wrote it. It's like, I don't care.
Yeah,
I'm not telling
you. We'll take it. But Hebrews, it does signify primarily written to a Jewish people, Jewish audience.
Yeah.
And it pulls
Jewish Christians, just to be
Jewish
clear.
Christians. It pulls maybe more than any other book on Old Testament, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. So it uses a very particular kind of, again, even the thought process is Jewish, where it will quote a verse from the Old Testament and then it will explain that verse. Mm-hmm. Very Jewish way of doing it.
Yeah.
So the whole book just is oozing with kind of the intellect, the mindset, the kind of deep commitment to God that you get in the Jewish faith.
Yeah, I remember a preacher. This is way back, right when kind of VR headsets were first coming in, first being thought of prototypes, and he used to say, for some of these stuff in the New Testament, you need to put your VR headset on, get into the Old Testament world, get into that way of thinking, that way of seeing, and never is it more true than for the book of Hebrews. But there's this little motif that runs through the whole book, really, but it kind of seems clear that these Jewish Christians are beginning to suffer for their faith. And they're up against some kind of hardship, maybe tempted to give up. And we've got this quote here that we just kind of wanted to use as a bit of a jumping off point from the charity Open Doors. And it's that they put the figure at 5,898 Christians murdered for their faith in 2021, which may be shocking to you.
It shocked me.
As we're on this globe. I mean, many places very comfortable to be a Christian, but in many places it's costing their lives.
Yeah. And so the question from that is, so what message would you send to those who are in the same church as those, say a church in Somalia, one or number of them have been killed. What is the message that you send to the other people in that church? Yeah,
I'm just kind of breaking out in cold sweat slightly thinking about, the scenario where you're asked to go and speak in that church.
Yeah.
What would you bring? What would you go and say? And in a sense, this letter to the Hebrews is that, isn't it? It is the message to the church that's begun to come up against some of the most severe persecution.
Absolutely. And so another way of thinking about it, if that's kind of fairly removed from our experience, which it won't be for everybody. People in Croydon have fled persecution.
Yeah.
Of various kinds. But I love film, so a Martin Scorsese film called Silence. Have you seen it?
I've seen it, yeah.
I'm surprised because you've not seen all the films I've seen. So it's set in the 17th century, so about 1630 I think it's set. There's two Jesuit priests, so Catholic priests, and they're going to Japan, which has been a very closed nation. And they're going there to really tell people about Jesus. But they're following in the footsteps of their mentor. So these two Catholic priests, Andrew Garfield, who was at one point Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And the other guy is Adam Driver, who I love. He's the baddie in Star Wars, isn't he?
Yeah.
In the new Star Wars. And they're going to look for Liam Neeson, who we probably most of us may or may not know. I was going to do a quote from him, but I won't bother. He's got a very particular set of skills in life. So they've gone to find him, and when they get there, they're shocked that the Japanese tradition is being so aggressively enforced against any person who's thinking of becoming a Christian. And even to the extent that Liam Neeson's character seems like he's probably really renounced the Catholic Christian faith and begun to adopt the traditional Japanese way of life. And these two guys, Andrew Garfield, Adam Driver, they end up experiencing firsthand what he's called the Grand Inquisitor, I think. Yeah, the Grand Inquisitor, torturing Christians, torturing them. Would they basically back away from the Christian faith?
Yeah.
And the question is, what would God say to them? As they're there in Japan trying to tell people about Jesus, what would God say to them? What would you think God would say to these Japanese Christians?
Yeah.
There's a scene, isn't there? A horrible scene where they put on crucifixes as the tide comes in.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult film to watch. But there's a clue in the name of the film what Martin Scorsese thinks God would say.
Yeah, it's an interesting little side note, the faith of Martin Scorsese, because he is very informed by a Catholic worldview. But yeah, this particular film, and I think I could be wrong here, but even more so than the book, because in the book which he based his film on, there is actually a revelation from the Lord, which some people take, but Scorsese seems to answer here silence.
Yeah. It's like Scorsese's read the first 37 chapters of Job and he's lost the last bit where God actually speaks.
Yeah.
But still, in our head, I think it's helpful. Like there's books in the Bible which really just put up in our face there is horrific suffering and genuine temptation to walk away from Jesus due to the experience that brings into your life.
Yeah. And
what does God say to you if you're in that place? So that's what we're looking at in the book of Hebrews, isn't it?
That's what we need to see.
So I quoted the book of Job.
You've quoted the book of Job, which does give us an answer, and it doesn't. It's an interesting one. We'll have to save that for our Old Testament epic adventure.
I thought we should do wrestling with the Old Testament,
as
a thing at some point. But yeah, so the book of Job does. I mean, it gives an answer, and even just by it being a book, it gives you an answer.
Yeah,
and it doesn't give an answer.
Yeah,
it doesn't maybe not give us the answer we want. But for Jews, it was deeply embedded within their faith.
Yeah,
along with others. And the thing about Hebrews is that what it does, it says, you know that answer that you got in the Old Testament from Job about this kind of stuff. Well, there's an even better answer.
Yeah, yeah.
And the answer is Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to look at.
Yeah.
The answer that Hebrews gives to people who are struggling to keep hold of their faith because it's really brought them into a bad time.
Yeah, because there does seem to be a wrestle, a question of these Jewish Christians. Which the letter addresses. They almost seem like they're being tempted just to step back into Judaism, don't they? Just to kind of either renounce Jesus totally or play him right down.
And I don't know, is this too controversial to make as an analogy, but it's quite tempting as somebody who really thinks Jesus is the most important person on the planet to ever have existed. It's quite tempted, and maybe even controversially, some churches even advocate for a faith which is just kind of a little bit like, well, don't worry too much about what Jesus actually said about his demands on your life. Just pray a prayer and then just kind of be nice. Just be nice.
Yeah.
And it feels a little bit like that. You know, the Jews could still continue to supposedly remain faithful to Yahweh, still live moral lives. As long as they just don't talk about Jesus and go to the church where people worship Jesus, they'll be fine.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of a parallel with the push that you get from secularism, the push you get from our culture, which is just be a nice person.
Yeah.
Don't go on and on about Jesus. Don't do all the real Christian stuff.
Yeah.
Just be nice.
Yeah. And even go back to the book and the depiction of the Japanese missionaries in silence, and with these guys, it's interesting how so much it can feel like the powers, I suppose, which we've talked about before, they will let you have 85, 90, 95% of what you want to do as a follower of Jesus. But not that 5%, not the bit that makes him absolute Lord, not that bit that undermines the powers, not that bit that knocks down Caesar, not that bit that honours the Japanese religion. That bit you can't do, and if you do that, it will cost you everything. And it so often seems to be the pattern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We'll let you have loads, but not Jesus in first place. That's the bit that will.
And that's powerful, isn't it? Because I think we can often think of, and the devil, evil can be presented as the absolute opposite of good, which it is. But often the strategy is you just slowly drift. You wake up and you think, it's a tiny decision, and it's like something that still feels kind of good. It's not like you're being tempted to run around and start trying to make everybody Satanists, but you just stop worshipping Jesus to such an extent. You stop reading his word and trusting it and trying to live it. You start to spend your money a little bit differently. You start to say slightly different things. You start to do different stuff with your worship and on your diary and your calendar, and that's the real thing that we see in this book, Hebrews.
Yeah. So let's get into the positive. What does he call us to? I mean, one big one, which again, we're talking about themes through the letters. I almost think of it as like top trumps. Top trumps where you've got the whichever characters or plants or animals or whatever, and they're listed like their abilities, their number, and you both play your card, and the one with the bigger number trumps it and you win. And to me, it's like the first bit of Hebrews is like Jesus is the trump card against all of Judaism. Or better than the angels, better than the patriarchs. He's better than the prophets. And so for me, one of the big things that the letter of the Hebrews calls us back to is Jesus. It's so simple, isn't it? But he's kind of at pains to show he is better. He is higher. Nothing else can replace him. Nothing else measures up to him. I mean, to use a fancy word, it's got to be Christocentric. It's got to be about Jesus.
So let me read just a little bit, first few verses, and then tell us why. Why is he better, Andy? So in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, which is wonderful that God would do that.
Yeah.
But he says, but in these last days he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful hand. After he had provided purification for sins, he'd sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs.
I mean, this is another one of these kind of high point mountain vistas on this trip. We looked a few weeks ago at Colossians 1. This is super similar. I think you referenced it in one of your devotionals that you did. It's this kind of idea of, if you or I took a day off, not much happens. Everything continues as normal. Even the death of the most powerful figure in this world, things will be back to normal very quickly. But if Jesus was to take a day off, it's like the cohesion of the universe, the thing that holds it together, the thing that keeps us in. It would all just. It's his power. It's his. It's he who holds it together. So that's one thing.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because we've just had the funeral of the Queen. Just this last week or so, and it was a day when it said the country would pause and stop.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting. You kind of travelling around, you see a few hairdressers, a few coffee shops are still open, and I guess if you're trying to survive with rate rises and all that kind of stuff, and you might consider doing that. But the Queen, who represents really the highest sovereign in our nation, you kind of actively choose to pause and stop, or you don't.
Yeah.
But with Jesus, the point he's making, isn't it, is that, and what you've just made, is that there would be no choice. Like you would just disintegrate. Everything would fall apart if he was not present, sustaining all things.
Yeah. So there's him holding things all together, and then I think at least part of the contrast and the trump with the prophets who came before is, those guys carried the word of the Lord and they spoke truth, but he represents the exact nature of the divine being. In a way, even as you were reading it, it reminded me of the parables, the story that Jesus told that we looked at before. First he sent servants and messengers, and finally he'll send his son. Surely they'll listen to him. But others were servants, others were good people, but he's the son.
I mean, it reminds me a little bit of an illustration I heard one time about somebody who's desperate to go to, let's just say, Disneyland or a theme park. Trip of a lifetime, fly to Florida, go to Disneyland, like take his kids. And so he's looking at the brochure, and the brochure's telling him all the stuff that is going to be available to him when he gets there, and kind of the map and all that kind of stuff, or the website these days, right? Looking at it all, and then you're like, wow, that's incredible. This is so helpful. This really enables us to see where we want to go. And then he said, but if you then got on the plane and flew to Florida, and when you were there, you just sat in your hotel and just looked at the brochure, you're like, what are you doing? Like, it's here. And that's really what Jesus is he is the fulfillment of everything that we could have wanted. It all
pointed to him. And you can spend a long time meditating on these ones. I like the way, I don't know how much it represents what was in the Papyrus. I like the way it's set out almost like poetry, because some of it is poetic. I love the verse 9, that God has set you above your companions, again this trump idea, by anointing you with the oil of joy. So it's like, what was Jesus' emotional disposition? Well, he was acquainted with suffering, he was a man of sorrows, and also he's anointed with joy. So you get the whole spectrum of emotion perfectly embodied, perfectly reflected, perfectly displayed. And one of the amazing things is, one truth about Jesus was he was the happiest person in the room. I find that so compelling from this bit of Old Testament poetry. And it's like, here it is.
So let's just to land this for you, I guess. There'll be moments you can think back on, probably even from this last week, where you've really felt like Jesus was far from you. You've thought you've been far from him. You feel like you failed him, or you've just not thought of him. You get to the end of the day and think, I didn't even remember I was a Christian. I didn't think about him all day. In all through that day, every nanosecond of that day, he was sustaining you. He was holding you together. He was causing your lung to keep beating. He was causing your lungs to keep pumping, your heart to keep beating. He was causing the synapses in your brain to keep flowing. And not only that, he was sustaining and holding together all the atoms and all the fabric of the air that you're breathing and the earth around you and gravity. It's all permanently and constantly. It's Jesus who is enabling you to continue. So it's kind of like, on one level, never doubt that he is for you, and the second level, like, never doubt that actually everything in the universe is all about him. Like, you can't find somewhere where he is not the thing that makes it all, where he's the most important being. You can't go to a different space and where his importance is minimized. He is the most important. He is the essential, unavoidable, elevated being in everything. And that's really the point he's making in these first chapters, isn't he?
Which we can almost kind of, not easily, but we can kind of nod to, because 2,000 years, Jesus is the preeminent figure in civilization, even just from a historical point of view. But then you kind of go back and you think, this was written in the 1st century. It's an extraordinary claim to make about a crucified Galilean carpenter.
I mean that. And so for some of you, you'll look around and you think, nobody else seems to believe. He's not recognised on the TV shows I watch. He's not talked about in my work. I'm not even allowed to talk about him really in my work. Really? But you're in the place the Hebrews were in. And he is the one who causes your workplace to be a viable, to have any existence at all. He is the one who sits in everything and beyond everything and above everything. And we now know who he is. He's always done that, but now we haven't just got a picture or some quite difficult to read prophetic words. We actually know his name is Jesus.
Yeah.
We know what he's like.
Yeah. Incredible.
And as you said, he also hits every climax of human emotion. The happiest guy in the room. Like, if you even just think from your own perspective, what would it like for you to be fully alive, to be the greatest version of yourself you could possibly be? Jesus shows you. It's just to be you with Jesus breathing into you and being the one who influences you in every way, and that's the greatest version of yourself.
Yeah. And this is just floating around chapter 1.
Yeah, so I mean, we've probably got to be slightly just cautious of time, don't we? Because you could, I mean, that's the beauty of this book.
Yeah.
I've read this, I don't know how many times I've read the book of Hebrews, but each time it's like, wow, it's some amazing stuff in here. So what's another thing that it pulls out? Because it's not just about the greatness of Jesus. It's also then the implications of that, isn't it? Which we see him develop really in chapters 3, 4, 5 and 6 and 7. We're on chapter 7, finishing this week, I think. So shall we have a look at chapter 3, verses 12 to 14, which is maybe a key moment in the book?
Yeah, let me read this. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. As has just been said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as you did in the rebellion.
So a quote from the Israelites travelling through the wilderness about how they stopped really trusting in God as their God, and instead they said, "Hey, let's go back to Egypt." And it's fascinating that he is telling Jewish believers who, in their own wilderness experience, it's not that they're short of water and food; they're getting threatened, rejected, like losing their jobs. Probably physically harmed, and he's basically saying, just in this wilderness that you're travelling through, if you now go back to Judaism, that's like you going back to Egypt. Which,
wow, yeah,
I mean, it's quite shocking, isn't it? Like, don't harden your hearts against what God's shown you is real. So I'm not sure that'd be my first message to this persecuted church.
Have that for some comfort.
But that says more about me, doesn't it?
Yeah.
More about how I've elevated the idea that being nice is what it's about.
Yeah.
Maybe in a way that even shows that I myself have gone back to the gods of my Egypt, which were as good, as English people, we should be nice. Yeah. Only.
Comfort.
So that's one. I mean, that's one. Chapter 4, verse 12. To 16 is another equally just powerful. This is a famous section about the word of God is alive and double-edged sword, and often we use that to talk about this book. Yeah. But in context, what he's basically saying is God's not going to miss anything. Like nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Verse 13, which comes immediately after the bone and marrow bit. Yeah. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Yeah. It's a bit like, God knows. He knows. Like, just don't think that you can kind of secretly deny him. Yeah. He sees you. Yeah. Now that's, I don't know. I slightly balk at that as a thing, but of course, this is written in love to a people that they wouldn't turn, wouldn't in a hard moment, they wouldn't, in the darkness, they wouldn't be denying what they know to be right, and good and true. Yeah. So there's a bit of that, but there's also some really good positives that we get in this as well. So there's a warning, like don't reject or walk away from this thing. But then in, say, chapter 6, verse 10, you get a bit where it says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you've shown him as you've helped his people and continue to help them. We want each of you to show the same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be fully realised. Don't become lazy. Imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what's been promised.
Yeah.
So it's not purely negative. It's not just a warning, is it? It's just a warning and an encouragement.
An encouragement and a promise. I mean, just reflecting now, going back to kind of our original question, what would you say to the church in suffering? What would you say to the persecuted church? What would you say to a people who are going through difficult times? I mean, this is a bit of a check for us, isn't it? Because I think my natural bent would want to be, some sort of obvious comfort and some kind of promise that these circumstances are going to shift at some point. Yeah. And then, just as we're talking, it is a little bit shocking, and I can see the wisdom in it, because we don't know the ins and outs, how many years this kind of persecution lasted, how long the season went on for. But for Christians at different times and in different places, that's been their entire experience, hasn't it? Yeah. It never got better for them. The persecution never softened in this age, and so the message isn't, hey, things are going to get better. It's Jesus is better. He's better than anything that you could pull away from and go back to, and God is watching. Like, stay faithful, and there will be reward. But it's interesting, isn't it? The warning as love.
Yeah, and I think a key thing there, isn't it? It says God is not unjust, and I guess that probably is the question that you're asking when you're looking around and you're seeing what looks easy is what others are choosing, and it feels like they get the easy. They turn away from coming to church, or from they don't make the sacrifices you make, and it feels like they're doing better. It can feel like is God just? Yeah. And he addresses that specifically. God isn't unjust. Yeah. It just takes. Just wait. Yeah, over the long enough time frame, it's going to play out. More than just. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if that's a good jumping off point. I wanted to pick up something that you wrote about in your devotional, and it's this idea of maturity and God bringing maturity. There's another little rebuke here. He's kind of saying, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truth of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. And it's this definition of maturity as the ability to distinguish between good and evil. And just that, when we were talking about time frames, what's the good option? I feel like backing off. And maturity is like, well, this is the righteous action, kind of come what may, even if it doesn't seem that, but I've walked this way long enough to know I'm mature, and therefore this is righteous, and to do otherwise would be unrighteous. And aren't those the people who you want around? Yeah. It's like a beautiful thing about church is you can just come across some people and they're just like, you're doing the right thing. Yeah. And you can just see they live it. They make the right choice just repeatedly, and it's almost like the hardiness or the perseverance. There's just something so deeply attractive about those people. And if you are becoming one of those people, just the benefit you are to others around you is probably hidden to you, but it's immense. Yeah, it's immense when you just continually choose to be like, I will show kindness. I will bite my lip at that moment. I will speak love. It's going to be mistreated, but I will speak love. Yeah. I will show up and worship. I will worship the Lord. I've had an awful week, but I will show up and do it. And you know what's right, and you do what is right. Yeah. And you know what is wrong, and you seek not to do what is wrong. Yeah. Those are the people, Hebrews chapter 11, they're the heroes. Yeah.